Hello, in this episode I'll be going through this low poly hand painted house. I'll take you through a few tips and tricks about how I made it, how I painted it, and then I'll leave a time lapse at the end if you want to look through and see the whole process. This episode is part of a much bigger course on gearbest.co.uk where you can go right through from beginner to advanced levels, and all the courses are free. If you have any questions or you want to chat about your projects, then come along to the Discord server and chat to like-minded people there about all things creative, and you can also join in the competitions there. Also, do check the description for any links, as I'll be posting any updates and links in there. Also, this got a staff pick on Sketchfab, which I was really pleased and quite surprised about. You can follow the links in the description and have a look at it on Sketchfab, and please comment with any of your thoughts. Okay, so let's have a look at the model. If I go full screen with Shift Spacebar, and we can just take a look at how I built it. So hopefully you should see it's a fairly simple model in many respects, and there's nothing too complicated. The only slight complicated bits are the tiles that are sticking out here. And I realised afterwards that the effort I put into these, which wasn't a great deal to be fair, but it was a tiny bit wasted. I could have just done a plane that stuck out and was jagged. Because once it's painted, if I go to Shift Z, you can't particularly see the shapes so much. I could have just hand painted them and it would have been fine, especially from this type of distance. So that's something I would take from this myself, is that when you're hand painting you can paint on a lot of the detail yourself. Of course you still need those sort of jagged edges, so you would need a plane across here with some jagged edges on it, but I don't need the whole tile in there. Another mistake I made was with these rocks and with these window ledges. There was no real need for these to be separate objects, these window ledges, and they're hardly noticeable from this distance. In fact, it was quite tricky to paint, and you can see I left a bit behind it because I was being lazy. These rocks have too many vertices. I didn't realise I'd done that. I think that was something to do with my bevel settings, and I'd already joined it all together and started painting, so I'd already unwrapped my object, so I couldn't very easily go in and delete these. There are other slight issues with n-gons here, and really that should be smartened up. Sometimes when you get sharp triangles like this as well, it causes problems, as you can see there. It's not so much on the render, and not really a problem. I knew it wouldn't be a big problem, that's why I kind of left them, especially from this kind of distance. You can't really tell. For the most part, it was just modelling things in terms of cubes, and then just adding a tiny bit of variation in places. And a lot of these are just separate objects that are all joined together in the end with Ctrl J. In fact, some of these, such as this window here, it would have been better if it was a separate object and not pulled out of the shape, because there's no real need for it to be part of this topology. It's not going to be animated, and in fact it would have been easier if it was a separate piece of geometry. So if you're doing something like this that sticks out from the shape, it's not going to be animated, just make it a separate object. So for example, if I go to paint mode now and have this button selected, if I right click to select the faces, I can isolate them and paint on just them, and it would have been much faster if that was just a separate face by itself. I'm also not so sure how much difference this bevel is really making, and whether that was worth the effort, because I kept having to go and select those edges as well whilst painting. And it did cause more seams. More seams generally mean more glitches in the painting occasionally. So I'll go back to edit mode. I have a tutorial about how I create trees, and I followed that technique. I'll try and remember to paste the link in the description. If I don't, please remind me, and I'll just update it. And also it's worth checking the description, because I can update the description if anybody asks any questions and put links in there as well. The clouds, I thought I'd experiment and just do a simple plane, which I extruded out and then painted on. They give a sort of cardboard cutout feel, and I thought that'd be quite interesting. I'm not sure whether it particularly works, and they could have just been flat planes actually. They didn't really need to have solidity, but I thought it might look interesting. The moon is the other thing that I don't particularly like. I just put a noise texture onto it with a slight emission. I don't know that I like it that much, but I was kind of running out of time on this project, and I kind of need to move on to other projects as well. You can also see in terms of the lighting that I've gone for very blue lights, and I've just got basic 3-point lighting going around, but most of them are sort of a bluey colour. So that one's blue, blue, and that one supposedly from the moon is a slightly yellowy, because we've got a sort of slightly yellowy moon. In order to get the emission coming from the texture, I actually texture painted the emission on, and you'll be able to see that in the time lapse. But if I go to my UV image editor up here, and I actually created a separate map, there's the house color map, and I just created a separate map for emissions. So if I click on the house, you can see there's the diffuse, there's the emission, and this is the emission factor. So the white bits will be emission, the black bits won't be. And I just set the emission color to a slightly yellowy color. I also added a bit of a glare. If I go to the scene tab here, and if you go to passes, you can tick on the emission, and that means when you go into the scene editor, which is in the node editor, in here, you can set up some compositing. And I think I'll have to do some tutorials on that soon. Do let me know if you'd like to see that. So it goes from the emission into a blur, mixed with a glare, and then it's sort of all added together into the final output. I thought I'd add a bit of a sort of dynamic effect with a bit of wind by putting leaves around the place. I could have put a bit more effort into those as well, and it might have been nice to have some sort of slight animation with the clouds moving and maybe with some leaves blowing across in slight circular patterns. That would have been quite fun. For the witch on top, I grabbed a free piece of art and just inserted it in. There is an add-on. If I press Shift A, you can go to Image as Planes and it will insert it in and it will keep its transparency. So that's a PNG with a transparent background, and it hooks it up all for you. And that's what it looks like in the end. A bit rough, really. And you sometimes have to think like that. What sort of things can you do to speed up the process? And I'd already spent far too long on the project, but I would have liked to have made my own weather vane, to be honest. When texture painting, if I go across the texture paint now, there's a couple of tips here. Whatever you have selected should be your active image. So if I select this one and make sure it's active in here as well, so house color, and that's house color. I'm not necessarily painting on the house color. The best way to make sure you are painting on the image you have selected is to go into edit mode and then back into texture paint mode. Now you can see the color of my object there and you can start painting on it. I have used this a lot as well, this face selection masking, so whatever I select I can paint on and it won't paint anywhere else. That's another advantage of having separate objects. If I deselect this and press, let's say, L over this, that will select the linked object. So anything linked to that face that I've hovered over. So if I deselect that and select with L again, just press L and then I can get just that tile. So if you've got separate objects, it does make it a bit easier. And at times it was a bit awkward. Let's say if I come in here, Alt F to zoom into where your cursor is. And if I wanted to paint down here, it was actually better to press L to select that linked object, go into edit mode, select the inverse with Control I for inverse, and then press H to hide. Now when I go back to texture paint mode, I've just got that object to paint on, which is very helpful. And Alt H will bring it all back again. As for the texture painting, I used my usual tricks, which was a light and a dark brush, the dark brush having a multiply, the light brush having a screen, and the light brush of course having a light texture and the dark brush having a dark texture. And then I just have my basic texture draw brush, and I used a texture mask as a brush head. That meant my textures were a bit noisy in this case, so they weren't so harsh. That's slightly different from the texture, which acts more like a stencil, whereas this is your brush head. I did occasionally change the stroke method to line and drew lines of shading and things. And I also changed the curve of my brush. This is a side view of your brush, so this bit will be 100% and it will become less opaque as it goes down. So this is like an opacity scale, and you just think of it like that's the side of your brush. So this bit's going to hit the canvas first and this last, so it's less opaque there. I actually prefer this brush, I think, so it's got a sharp point and it's got a bit more control, especially when you're painting the details. You might want to use that curve. So I think that's it for the main tips. But remember, if you do have any questions, get across to the Discord server or put a comment and I'll reply to you.